Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here to give you your steampunk fix. Today I have another excerpt of Barrington Smith's journal by Marcus Brook. This one is The Duel. Oh, don't be ridiculous, Captain, she returned impatiently. You can't stand, never mind fight. And with an exasperated snort, she turned back to end the conversation, then stepped forward and plucked the Askiel from the ground. A gasp went up from the ring of onlookers, then silence. They all turned to look at the king. He hadn't moved, and still didn't. For long moments he remained still, as unblinking as a statue. A light breeze briefly disturbed the feathers on his headdress, fluttering them against the multitude of bracelets that adorned Queen Moesse's arm as her hand rested on his shoulder. It was one of those sudden, localized swirls in the air that sometimes form dust devils. This one couldn't quite work up the energy, but despite the lack of dust, you could still follow its progress faintly as it swirled its way across the ground towards her ladyship. It briefly caressed her hair as she faced Moponxi. The spell was broken, and with a wicked grin, the champion unleashed a barrage of gibberish. While I couldn't follow the words at all, his contemptuous sneer made the general tenor abundantly clear. Her ladyship translated it all for me later, and I'll set the translation down here. Put it down, little girl. Run to the waterhole and get a drink for your protector. Then maybe he'll be a man enough to stand and fight. Her ladyship looked him in the eye and replied in kind. Oh, he's man enough to face you and beat you, little boy. But he's feeling a bit under the weather at the moment, so I don't want to bother him with trivia. Moponxi clearly didn't know what to do with that. I guess he was so used to being the biggest and nastiest bully in the tribe. Probably no one had talked back to him like that since he was a child. Maybe not even then. Again silence descended, and the crowd held their breaths as the warrior struggled to process what he'd just heard. Alone of the assembled peoples, his face moved, as expression after expression chased across his countenance, witness to the thoughts and feelings behind his eyes. At first was incomprehension, then confusion, contempt, humiliation, and a brief moment of fear, fleeting and quickly suppressed, but there none the least. Finally, fury took over, and grew from spark to flame to blaze, as he drew himself up to full height. If that is what you think, little girl, then you don't know much, he spat. Her ladyship laughed and spoke quietly, though loud enough to be heard by everyone. I know more than a child like you. Again the silence followed, and the stillness. Again the expression passed across Moponxi's face, in sequence. Again he drew himself up to full height, and opened his mouth to speak, and her ladyship stepped forward. One single pace, though 30 separated them. Just one pace, then she stopped and assumed parade rest, grounding the butt of her assegai with a thump that any Scotsguard would be proud of. At that moment, every eye was riveted onto her. She was Britannia Bellona. Diana and all the rest, all rolled into one, and her 5 feet 4 inches stood highest by far. The crowd had seemed to be holding their breath before. Now they really were. They had seemed still before, but now they were carved from granite. The brief wind had passed, and the scene was like a painting, as nothing moved at all. No, not quite nothing. From my position, I could see the king across the square, and I saw his expression morph slowly from the usual stern blankness towards a faint smile. He noticed me looking at him and returned my gaze. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. No one not looking directly at him would have seen it, but I did. And in that moment I understood. King Umslopogus was as much a captive as I was. A captive of his own bodyguard and an ambitious queen, and unable to do a damn thing about it. He was hemmed in by tradition, religion, and tribal politics, rather than spear-wielding lunatics, admittedly, but no less free for all that. And with his own life balanced on knife edge the same way as mine. Suddenly, though, he could see a way out. Maybe for the first time in months or years, he could glimpse a tiny chink of light in the darkness. Maybe so small as to hardly be there at all. Maybe so dim that only one who's been looking for a long time could discern it at all. But it was there. It didn't help us much at that moment, of course, and I understood there was nothing he could do to interfere with the current events. But a brief hope flared in my mind that, in the unlikely event of her ladyship could beat the man-mountain facing her, we just might not be horribly murdered immediately afterwards. I nodded in return to cement the alliance, and we both returned our gaze to the tableau before us. Meanwhile, Mabonxi's brain had clearly finished its work, and the fury was back now, blazing white-hot and barely under control. But control it he did. Even in these matters, even here, there are proprieties to be observed. As tribe champion, commander, egotistical bully, and maybe future king, he was obliged by the dictates of machismo to have the last word. He chose to have quite a few of them, and they came tumbling out of his mouth in a barely coherent stream. "I believe you think I'm going to kill you, little girl. That's why you're doing this. That's why you insult me. You are looking for an easy and quick death. Well, I promise I won't be doing that. No, I'm going to come over there and take the spear off you, and then I'm going to hurt you. Hurt you badly. I'm going to cut your hands. I'm going to cut your feet. I'm going to cut your face and cut out your eyes." Of course, I couldn't understand a word, but his arrogance, obvious brutality, and frankly evil expression left me in no doubt of the general tenor of his thoughts. Her ladyship, of course, just stood there, inclining her head a little, as if curious where he was going with it. "Then, when you can't get away," he continued, "I'm going to drag you to my hut and throw you on my bed and keep you there till I grow tired of you." The king's eyes flickered briefly towards his queen, who had stiffened visibly. Her hand was still resting on his shoulder, but her attention was now firmly elsewhere. "Then I'll give you to the warriors!" And he made a great encompassing gesture to his cronies clustered round the king, some of whom I've noticed had the decency to look a little uncomfortable. He concluded with a roar. "I'll make sure you live a long, long life, little girl, and I hope you enjoy it." And brandishing his spear aloft, in a manner reminiscent of that self-satisfied bounder, Heathfield Stevenson, the time he scored a century at Lord's, her ladyship covered her mouth with her left hand and yawned. "If you're the strongest of them, I doubt there will be much to enjoy," she replied. She'd spoken softly with a smile, and that time-honored wiggle of the little finger of the left hand that crosses all boundaries of culture and language. For all her relaxed posture and laconic manner, though, her right hand tightened on the assegai, and the smile never touched her eyes. The reply was so unexpected that a smattering of laughter broke out, mostly among the women grouped on the king's left. It was quickly stifled. It was too much for Mapongsi. "Maybe the hut can wait. Maybe I'll show you here and now." The warrior hefted his spear and shield and stepped forward. Her ladyship had succeeded in making him angry all right, and the big idiot was probably more likely to make a mistake as usual. But he was just so big and strong, I couldn't see what difference it could possibly make. I tried to stand, managing to get my right leg under me, and levering my splinted left off the stretcher with a jolt. Pain shot through me like a hot lance. I gasped, or possibly screamed, my vision clouded. The world span around me, and I fell back onto the webbing. Again I tried to stand, but this time I was pressed back down by my guards with a hand on each shoulder and a razor-sharp blade across my throat. I tried to move anyway, but her ladyship had obviously heard me and, looking around, gestured for me to stay down. Reluctantly I obeyed. Mapongsi strode towards her, her ladyship oozing malevolence. "Stop!" I suspect there was only one voice that could have cut through the warrior's fury, and he heard it now. Not the king's, not one of the warriors, certainly not one of the women. It was the queen's. Without a backwards glance, she stepped away from the throne and stalked towards the warrior, who looked at her in confusion. "Why?" he asked. Planting her beat hard with a clash of anklets, Mwesi faced him down, then reached out and plucked the spear from his hand. "It is not seemly." "What? Why not?" "Don't be stupid. You were supposed to kill the white man, not the woman. You'd be a laughingstock." And she reached out her other hand to relieve him of his shield. "I'll do it." And with that she pushed the warrior away. He departed reluctantly to stand with his cronies, clearly knowing he was beaten. The queen turned towards her ladyship. "Somebody give her a shield." She addressed the audience. "We are going to do this properly." And she gestured to one of the warriors. He immediately ran off towards a large hut adjacent to the king's, which I guess must be the armory. And this was confirmed a few moments later as he emerged with a cowhide shield that matched the queen's own. He ran straight towards her ladyship and threw it down at her feet. She grasped the central staff and lifted the contraption off the ground. With the foot in the dust, the tip stood a good 10 inches above her own head. There's no way she'd be able to see over the hide. The crowd laughed, and the queen visibly sneered. "I cannot fight with this," said her ladyship, and let the thing fall back to the ground. "Too big for you, little girl?" the queen mocked. "The shield is made for individual warrior, or am I wrong in this?" "True, but we have no warriors so small that our warrior shield would fit you." "Then show me what you have for hunting." The queen paused for a moment, then nodded. "Give her a choice." And the queen gestured to 2 warriors who brought armfuls full of shields in variety of sizes. "Lay them out nicely for our guest this time. She's going to die in a few minutes, so we may as well be polite." Her ladyship immediately picked up a smaller 3-foot 6-inch version of the war shield. As she hefted it, she could see it was far lighter, and the staff had a wickedly pointed tip, which I imagined might come in useful. Unsatisfied, however, she rejected it and tried another, then a third. Finally, she spotted something in the crowd that caught her attention, and she pointed. "That one." The dancer holding the object of her attention looked nonplussed for a moment, then, at her ladyship's impatient come-hither gesture, stepped out and extended a small shield she was holding, little more than 1.5 feet in length, and maybe 9 inches wide. It was clearly decorative rather than defensive. She took it from the woman's hand with a graceful nod, and the crowd laughed again. The Amahahu is made for dancing, not fighting. Is that really what you chose? Asked the queen. It is. Very well. Is there anything else you would like to change? I'd be happy to swap this. She flourished the assegai for the captain's pistol. The crowd roared at that. The queen raised an eyebrow in a sort of old-fashioned look. Our own dear empress does so well. Her ladyship shrugged. Very well then, Mwesi, shall we dance? At the sound of her given name, the queen, angry at the familiarity, moved at last. Her ladyship stepped to the center of the arena and faced the queen as she advanced, like a cheetah stalking its prey. When a scant 3 yards separated them, the queen, with a blood-curdling yell, leaped forward, leading with her shield. Her ladyship sidestepped to her right, but not fast enough, and the impact of the cowhide thrust her off balance. Recovering, she turned to face Mwesi again. Their positions were now reversed, and the queen advanced again with a smile. The same thing happened again, and again. Every time the queen attacked, her great height and strength and fundamental viciousness overpowered her ladyship and sent her stumbling. So far, the assegai in her right hand hadn't been deployed at all. The queen attacked again, this time setting her shoulder to her shield. Her ladyship was lifted bodily off the ground by force and fell back full length in the dust. These softening up attacks were intended for more psychology than victory. This was theater, pure and simple, and the crowd were loving it. All except the king, who was starting to frown. Mwesi, this is not seemly, he called. The king made as if to rise, but remained seated as if unable. He glanced up in shock to see Mpongsi, now standing behind the throne where the queen had before, with his hand pressing down firmly on the king's shoulder. The shock that registered on the king's face was as clear as day, as they were both the understanding and fear that followed it. The queen glanced over at her husband, and his champion, seemingly satisfied with the tableau, replied, Very well, I'll move things on a bit faster. Mpongsi smiled grimly at that, clearly understanding she was hinting at more than the duel. The king subsided. Returning her attention to the task in front of her, the queen advanced again, this time slashing her assegai through the air in a threatening manner. The real fight was clearly about to begin. Her ladyship stood her ground and waited. Again the queen charged, but this time her ladyship sidestepped a little, at the last instant, allowing the shields to clash, but keeping herself clear of the main thrust. The queen spun around and came at her again, once more leading with the shield, this time at arm's length, but now following through with a vicious slash from her assegai, aimed through the side of the shield where her ladyship's exposed flank should have been. Fortunately it wasn't, and the assegai cleaved nothing but air. The queen danced away a few paces to survey the damage, and was plainly a little surprised to see there was none. Once again her ladyship waited, cowhide shield advanced in her left hand, assegai held downwards and to the rear in her right. At first glance it looked like the stance of a beginner, as the assegai would take too long to get into play from there to make an effective riposte. But her ladyship doesn't make that sort of mistake. No, I could see her game. She was attempting to lure her opponent into focusing on the shield and forgetting the weapon. Her stance seemed defensive so far as she'd not used the assegai at all, let alone initiating any attacks, and the queen knew she wasn't familiar with the weapons. Mwesi advanced, once more attempting to bat her ladyship's shield out of the way, to expose her flank. And again, the assegai slashed around the queen's shield, and again it failed to connect. But it was closer than the last time. Again the process repeated, and again the slash was closer. All around, the crowd was silent, expecting the next to be a serious blow, or maybe the next after that. My own heart was in my mouth, but I knew her ladyship fairly well by now, so I could tell she was up to something. One more pass, and the queen's assegai struck a little higher this time, passing within an inch of her ladyship's cheek, and severed an errant lock of her hair. The dark strands seemed to hang in the air for a moment before drifting to the ground between the combatants. The queen looked pleased and advanced again, slowly this time, savoring the moment before her next strike, which would surely be fatal. No, I thought, she still won't strike to kill this time. She wants to draw out the spectacle. This one will be designed to hurt and to bleed, but not stop for the fight. Her ladyship obviously thought the same, as when the shields clashed again, she ducked, batting the queen's shield high and allowing the assegai to pass above her head. Then, for the first time, her weapon made a contribution, sweeping around in a great arc from the rest towards the royal ankles. With a crash of blades on the anklets, it connected. With a yelp, the queen leapt back out of range. The crowd gasped, and the queen looked scared, but only for a moment. No blood adorned the beaten earth, and after flexing her ankle, she clearly felt no pain or difficulty. In a moment, she was advancing again, angry this time. Here it comes, I thought grimly. This time the queen struck downward with her shield, inflicting less of a blow than before, but driving the staff's point to tip firmly into the ground. Jane again struck for the ankles, but this time her blade met the hardwood staff with a thunk and stopped dead. The wood gripped the steel for a fraction of a second, and the queen slashed again. The stroke was hard, but missed, fouling with the edge of the queen's own shield. Then her ladyship's blade was free, and she danced out of range. She can't see, I realized. The standard warrior's shield comprises a staff half as high as the crown of his head, and the oval of cowhead that comes up to his nose, providing good protection, allied with visibility. Here the queen, though tall, was not as tall as the man-mountain Mpongsi, and it was his shield she was using. His assegai, too, for that matter, which was likely 6 inches longer and a pound or so heavier than she was used to. Jane must have noticed, went through my head, and I berated myself for using the informal address even in my thoughts. But is that advantage enough? The exchange repeated a couple more times with minor variations. Then it was the queen's turn to ring the changes. The shield met again, but this time rather than striking around to the right side, the queen pivoted on her left foot, turning her back to the fight for an instant, and struck at her ladyship's backhand. The blow was of necessity badly aimed, and Jane was quick enough to parry with her own assegai. Sparks flew as the blade struck, bright enough to be visible even in the blazing sunshine. Mwesi's blade flew wide, and her ladyship's riposte shot out like a cobra towards the queen's eyes, ignoring the exposed flank. It didn't connect, but won't try that again, came through my mind. Mwesi retired a few paces to think for a moment, but now her ladyship took the initiative in advance, not leading with the shield, but more in the manner of a medieval man-at-arms with sword and buckler. The queen responded as her training had taught her, interposing her shield, which her ladyship proceeded to rain blows down upon, forcing her to step back 3 paces before backing off to breathe. Visibly shaken by the abrupt change in the dynamic, the queen, nevertheless, advanced once more. Once more the shields connected, but this time the queen kicked the bottom of her own outward, and left hard. Her ladyship's shield was forced right and high, blocking her own thrust and leaving her left side completely open. The queen was already striking, and her assegai connected just below the ribs and slashed diagonally across her ladyship's belly, with an audible shriek of steel on bone. The crowd gasped as one. The anatomist in me briefly wondered what bone it might be there, but I knew it didn't matter as, with a great exhalation, her ladyship doubled up around the wound. It was a killing blow and no mistake. Not at all. I tried to close my eyes, unwilling to watch the inevitable, but I could not. I've seen soldiers disemboweled in battle, or shot by swords, and I expected the same grisly sight now. In horror, my mind waited to see her ladyship fall, or, worse still, stand quivering as she tried in vain to hold her guts inside her body. I wasn't the only one to make the assumption. The queen, with a satisfied smirk, threw aside her shield and advanced for the last time towards her victim. Clearly she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that there would be no resistance. The fight was obviously over, but she intended to finish her opponent quickly to spare her a lingering, agonizing, but no less inevitable death. Gripping her assegai just below the blade, she grasped her ladyship's hair with her left hand and wrenched her head up and back. I've seen the Zulu kill this way many times. A single hard thrust of the knife or spear upward from beneath the chin. There's no doubt it is quick. So quick it's bound to be painless. And in this dark continent, it counts as mercy. Even so, I couldn't watch. At last I was able to shut my eyes. Sadly, I was unable to shut my ears, and they caught the sound of the wet impact, and the queen's grunt as she pulled all her force into the blow. Then a gasp. Then silence. I waited for the sound of her ladyship's body hitting the ground. Maybe a yell of triumph from the queen, and the expected cheers from the assembled crowd. I did not want to see her ladyship dead, a collapsed heap of white in a lake of red, preferring to fix my mind on the image of her, standing tall and unbowed. I resolved to keep my eyes shut until the end, which, given the outcome of the duel, I knew could not be more than minutes away for me. The silence stretched on and on. After what seemed like an eternity, but was certainly not more than a few seconds, my damned innate curiosity overcame all resistance, and I opened my eyes a little. The scene was not as I expected. Not at all. The queen was there, of course, still on her feet, in a manner of speaking, but leaning heavily over her ladyship's shoulder, and looking more like a sack of potatoes than a conquering heroine. Her arms waved vaguely, as if still trying to strike at her ladyship's back, but her nerveless fingers had already dropped her assegai. Confused and not knowing what had happened, I sought her ladyship's weapon in the tableau, and was at first unable to find it. Her ladyship took a stumbling a couple of steps backward. Clearly the queen's legs were failing too. Unable to support the weight, her ladyship lowered the queen to the ground, as gently as she could and cradled her head in her lap. As she turned, the moment revealed her ladyship's assegai at last, or the tip of it anyway, in the form of a small triangle, gleaming wetly red and protruding from the queen's right shoulder. The foot-long, leaf-shaped blade was entirely out of sight, and the shaft protruded downward from a huge wound below the queen's ribcage. Dark red blood pumped out steadily, and a pool began to form. A murmur of unease passed through the crowd, but no one moved. Finally, with a roar of incoherent rage, Mopongse stepped forward and advanced across the dirt. Behind him, the king remained seated for a moment more than making a decision, rose and picked up his ancient ceremonial battle-axe from where it had lain at his feet. He hefted it for a moment, as if reacquainting himself with the weight and balance, and followed his champion. "White whore!" yelled the warrior. "How dare you? I will kill you with my bare hands!" Her ladyship remained where she was, cradling the dying queen, and replied calmly, though loudly enough to be heard by all. "I have been many things in my life, even that, though never the wife of a king." She raised her gaze to meet his, nor his bodyguard. I'd have thought the barb was too subtle for the beast, but it clearly struck home as, with a bound, he launched himself towards her. From behind the warrior there came a brief whir, akin to the sound of eagle's wings as it leaves the ground, and suddenly, with a sound like a heavy wet thud, the warrior stopped dead. Mopongse stood for a moment with wide-eyed expression of shock and surprise on his face, before falling forward full length on the ground. His left hand reached in vain for his intended victim, and for a few moments it seemed as if he was trying to pull himself forward by the strength of his fingers alone. Then he lay still. From the center of the warrior's back, between the shoulders, protruded the king's battle-axe, the beak-like spike gleaming brightly in the sun, and opposite, the broad half-moon blade was buried half-deep in his spine. The king strode up to his former champion, placed a foot firmly on his neck, and levered the blade from its target. In the crowd, the dripping blade drew a ring around him with warrior's blood. In that moment, the king was a tremendously powerful figure, clearly still strong despite his years, and absolutely sure of himself. "Does anyone else wish to dispute the outcome?" he asked loudly. The crowd was silent. "Anyone?" he asked again at a shout, and once more turned full circle, meeting every gaze. "The duel is sacred," he yelled. "Trial by combat is judged by the spirits. The outcome is final and cannot be disputed." The cluster of Mopongse's cronies shuffled nervously, and for a moment one or two of them seemed inclined to argue. Wisely, though, they kept their mouths shut. Satisfied for the moment, the king kneeled by the queen and looked into her eyes. Glazing they were, but the life was still not quite gone. "I did not want to kill her," the ladyship offered, "but she left me no choice." "I know, but it is well that you did this," he nodded, "or soon I would have had to do the same." I realized that the king's dark, inscrutable eyes were watering as he continued. "And," he hesitated, "I loved her once." Turning his gaze to the fading eyes, he said, "Farewell, Muasi." He murmured, "I will try to remember the girl I knew, and forget the queen." Wessie tried to speak, though her eyes were clearly already unfocused. But she couldn't. Her mouth worked for a second, leaking blood at the corner, then was still. The pulse, still visible in her neck, slowed and stopped. After a moment, the king sighed and rose. "You," he waved at one of the ladies in waiting, "go and collect the queen's bed and treasures." And to everyone else he ordered, "Fetch wood! Build the pyre here! She died with honor." No one moved. "Go!" And the crowd dispersed rapidly to search for wood. The king squatted back down opposite her ladyship. "I cannot quite thank you for your victory," he said, "but it was well done. Few of my warriors could have beaten her. The queen was the better warrior. I was just lucky." And her ladyship lifted her arm to indicate the long gash in her corset, where the queen's assegai had struck. In places, the blade had cut right through all the layers of fabric to nick the skin, witness to the force of the blow. Spots of blood marked the material, but the steel springing still showed intact. Gleaming in the sun where the blade had scraped off the galvanizing. "So was she," he replied. "I saw you land the first blow." "If it wasn't for her bangles," he rolled his eyes, "the fight would have ended then, and she'd have been Muesi Funutu for the rest of life." "But she would have lived." "Yes." And he lowered his eyes once more to the queen's limp form. "It is better this way." Her ladyship looked confused by this exchange, and the king's solicitous tone. It was unusual to see her slow on the uptake, but I recall that she'd been a little preoccupied while he and I had had our silent conversation, and I'd no time to exchange a word with her since. I made a discreet, placating gesture, and she dropped the issue. The first of the tribe began to return to the arena. 4 warriors bearing the largest wooden bed I'd ever seen. For all their size, they were struggling with the huge construction, which seemed to be about 8 feet square, built of striped mahogany boughs, piled high with soft deerskins, and with a huge lion pelt over it. "That's not the queen's bed," the king said. "Why are you bringing it here?" "This is Mpongzi's," one replied. Shaka, I believe his name was. He had been the dead warrior's second in command. "We will build his pyre here, too." "No," the king replied. "His actions would have dishonored the tribe forever." He kicked the enormous corpse and faced the warriors until their gazes dropped. "This Vunde poisons the air. Drag it to the other side of the ditch and leave it there. The vultures and hyenas will feast tonight and celebrate the return of one of their own." Reluctantly, they moved to obey, but the king stopped them and pointed to the bed. "First, put that back where it came from." And once more he placed his foot deliberately on the back of the fallen warrior's neck, grinding his face into the dirt. "The bed, the hut, and all the carrion's possession belong to our guests now. And after this unpleasantness, I'm sure they could do with some rest." Chaka looked confused, and more than a little worried. "But we had to break the wall to get this out." "Well, it's time you learned to mend," the king roared, his patience finally at an end. "And learn fast!" So quoth this raven. Thank you, my darlings. I hope you enjoyed this little steampunk story. I do so love the tales of Barrington Smith and his beloved ladyship. If you like, please visit Marcus's page and let him know on Twitter, and please like and subscribe to me if you would. my darlings. And if you have something to say, leave a comment, and I promise I will comment back. Bye-bye, my darlings.